Welcome to Season 5 of the Long-Winded One podcast. Listen as we showcase original work from top Royal Road authors read by professional voice actors. Hear interviews from your favourite lit RPG and game lit authors. Lastly, listen as the Long-Winded One tries his hand at his first ever lit RPG novel, The Four Treasures.
Excerpt of Mistaken for a Returnee. Written by Alex White and read by Luke S. Jones. Just as he'd predicted, Aldritch saw more of the blue-suited men. But instead of investigating something, they were coming and going from the building. Aldritch noted how none of the blue-suited men ever left the building alone. He only saw them traveling in groups of 3 or more. Those returning from wherever they'd gone were often dragging lone men and women with them. The people brought in were always in wooden chains that linked both arms, both legs, and their neck to a wooden brace encircling their waist. Aldritch used Wisdom of the Great Sage on everyone entering and exiting the building. To his surprise, none of the people he scanned had a system installed on them. The blue-suited men and the chained individuals were, as far as Aldritch could tell, just normal civilians. A sentinel back home was a watcher of sorts, Okairo explained. They were artificial guardians of the royal tombs in the human realms. Maybe these men serve the same purpose here.
I agree with them being defenders, but I don't think it is the tombs they guard. Judging by the appearance of the prisoners, I would assume them to be either a slave-trading organization or a group of peacekeepers. And since I don't see any horrified expressions on the other citizens, I'm inclined to believe it's the latter,
Aldritch said. As he spoke to Okairo, Aldritch glanced at the civilians surrounding them. None of them paid the sentinels or the prisoners a second or third glance after sating the inherent curiosity all mortals possessed. Which meant one of two things. Aldritch was correct, the sentinels were peacekeepers, or this world was very comfortable with the idea of enslaving their fellow mortals. Aldritch hoped it was the former that was true. Mind you, it wasn't because he hated slavery or wished to see it abolished. Sometimes such evils were justified, especially the way they'd handled slaves back home. To enslave your fellow mortals would see you hanged by the wrists on a public viewing platform, where you would slowly starve to death, or be eaten by the birds, whichever came first. There was only one organization that could legally still enslave mortals across the 7 nations. Oberon's Scales were the fanatical worshippers of Okairo's brother, Oberon, dragon god of justice. Oberon supposedly granted his worshippers the ability to see the sins a person had committed and could make them relive the horrors they'd inflicted on others. It was said that by the time the group was done with the criminal, the perpetrators would beg for the torment to end and willingly enslave themselves to the families of their victims. But it wasn't as if this was the fate of all criminals the Scales caught. They only enslaved murderers, rapists, or thieves who directly caused the deaths of another person. Everyone else was handed over to the local authorities, as they weren't worth any more of the Scales' attention. "Remember when they tried to arrest you?" Okairo asked, and Aldritch could sense a wave of smug satisfaction coming through the bond.
I do. They took offense to some of the people I'd killed and tried to bring me before Oberon. They might have actually succeeded if you hadn't interfered,
Aldritch replied while continuing to watch the front door of the roost. He spotted a trio of sentinels standing just inside the doorway of the roost, 3 helmeted heads pointing directly at him. Based on the body language he could see, Aldritch could tell they were whispering to one another. "Who did you kill to piss them off?" Okairo asked. Though Aldritch thought the question could apply to the sentinels watching him, he knew his lord was actually still thinking about his run-in with the Scales.
I don't recall,
Aldritch replied. He watched the trio of sentinels leave the building and walk towards him in a triangle formation, their bodies practically screaming their desire for conflict. Aldritch imagined them waking up today and begging the gods, or anyone else who would listen, for the chance to prove their power and authority to someone. Aldritch smiled at the 3 men as they approached. He found it very interesting that the two flanking the third had their hands resting on the pommels of their clubs, while the third man kept his body as relaxed as he possibly could. But Aldritch knew it was an act. His knees were too stiff, his posture too rigid. By putting on a show of being relaxed, the sentinel had inadvertently made himself seem even more stressed than if he just approached normally. It's always amusing to see how those who've never known combat always seem so eager to start a fight, Okairo chuckled.
Hello, gentlemen,
Aldritch said, holding out his hand for the leader to shake.
You stand before Aldritch of Clan Blackshield. Might I know your names? He asked.
Aldritch doubted they would respond in kind. Few had in this new world. But that wouldn't stop him from showing them some common courtesy.
Why are you loitering around the roost?
The leader asked. His voice was slightly muffled due to the helmet, and both hands remained firmly by his side. Aldritch kept his hand extended for a few more seconds before lowering it and dropping his smile at the same time.
Try again,
Aldritch replied while staring down at the shorter men. One of the two at the back was obviously a dwarf, but the other men were a bit more difficult to place. The leader was bulky beneath his armor, but he was also tall, standing only a few inches shorter than Aldritch. It was unlikely he was a dwarf, halfling, gnome, goblin, or any of the other shorter races.
What did you say?
The sentinel replied incredulously. His body tensed as his hand reached for the club at his waist. Aldritch stared at the sentinel for a second before reaching out with his left hand. He placed his palm atop the sentinel's helmet and gripped it. He pulled the helmet clear of the man's head with a light but firm tug. A youngish-looking human man with a shaved head stared up at Aldritch with wide eyes. Aldritch noticed the two other sentinels freeze at the sight of him pulling off their friend's helmet. Aldritch was also amused to note the hostility they were projecting had seemingly vanished into thin air, resulting in the three of them standing in shocked silence.
I said,
Aldritch began, ignoring the surprised expression on the human sentinel's face.
Try again. You wish for people to respect you, yes?
It took a second for Aldritch's words to register, but the human eventually nodded.
That's completely understandable. Young people like yourselves,
he was assuming all three were young for their races,
have an inherent desire to feel respected, but you won't get respect by acting like self-important little brats. Respect is earned by your deeds and maintained by your behavior. It's not given just because you put on the uniform of a peacekeeper,
Aldritch explained while watching the three of them for any sudden moves.
If you understand, then introduce yourselves.
The human sentinel flinched as Aldritch thumped him on the forehead.
Keep your back straight when you introduce yourself. Take pride in who you are, and try again,
Aldritch said while staring into the human's eyes. Still extremely confused, the human straightened his back and said, My name is Cal Morthis, Initiate Sentinel.
Good,
Aldritch replied and smiled at the human.
Now, what are your names?
He asked the other two. They looked between themselves for a second before the one on the left straightened his back.
Take off your helmet before you introduce yourself,
Aldritch said, interrupting the sentinel, who froze like Aldritch had just slapped him across the face.
Sorry,
the sentinel muttered before taking off his helmet, revealing a young, dark-haired dwarf with an unkempt beard.
Lorik Cragbrewer, of Clan Drakebeard. I'm also an Initiate Sentinel.
Aldritch nodded to the dwarf, but on the inside he was frowning. The dwarf should know better than to act this way. Aldritch didn't know how the other races raised their kids, but he knew dwarves. If the elders of his clan knew how he was swaggering around the city. Without saying anything, Aldritch turned to the final sentinel and was pleased to see a young human woman standing there with her helmet tucked under her left arm. She had short black hair that was shaved on one side of her head and hung to her chin on the other.
Artemis Maya Theanol, I'm also an Initiate Sentinel,
she said, and offered Aldritch a quick salute. Aldritch glanced down at the armor they were wearing. He hadn't thought it was thick enough to hide their form so well, but he supposed it did make sense. Without the system, they would need thicker armor to withstand blows their bodies could not. After a second to absorb that knowledge, Aldritch nodded.
Well then, Cal Morthus, Hilkin Loric Crag Brewer of Clan Drakebeard, and Artemis Maya Theanol. Once again, you stand before Aldritch of Clan Blackshield. A pleasure to meet all of you,
Aldritch said, a slight smile on his face.
And as much as I'd enjoy getting to know each of you, I do have places to be. You're dismissed, Sentinels,
he told them and nodded as the three of them shot him a salute before donning their helmets and leaving. What the fuck did you just do? Okairo asked, astounded by what he'd just seen. Did you use some kind of enchantment magic, and I somehow missed it? Aldritch shook his head and departed for the next landmark.
Of course not. I wouldn't waste the mana.
Then how?
They're young soldiers. They'd never been in combat, true, but they are still soldiers. I assumed they would behave as all young soldiers would when presented with a higher-ranking officer.
Aldridge, you're not a higher-ranking officer.
Oh, I'm aware. But they clearly weren't.
This has been Mistaken for a Returnee, written by Alex White and read by Luke S. Jones. Produced for Season 5 of the Long-Winded One podcast. The author and/or any present or future publishing company retains all of the rights for the associated work. This work was read by permission of the author. Hey everyone, this is Luke S. Jones, the narrator for this episode of the Long-Winded One podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard here today and would like to keep up with whatever else I've got going on, you can give me a follow on social media at Luke Voice of Jones. I'm also a voiceover actor working in all facets of the voiceover industry, including video games, commercials, animation, narration, audiobooks, you name it. So if you'd like to get in touch regarding a potential booking for voiceover work, you can head to voiceofjones.co.uk where all of my demo reels are available. You can send an email to studio@voiceofjones.co.uk or get in touch with my agent at That's What They Said Voice Agency. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us down this Lit RPG deep dive. Please consider giving us a review on Apple Podcasts and visit us over at longwinded.one, where you can see past episodes and find all of our socials, even our new Discord server. We hope you enjoy.